Welcome back to CTN. I'm your host, Robert Van Sluten. In the last episode, we were talking about modules, and we started talking about the build process because the two are related. What I want to do in this episode is finish the discussion on build and application settings. Let's get started. Start with some definitions. A bundle. A bundle is a directory in the app's directory structure. It contains the executable and resource files, such as images and audio files. Now, previously, we talked about the sandboxed directory structure. This is a directory within that contains these items. There's this notion of an info.plist, and you've probably seen this if you've searched around the navigator. It's usually the application, the project name dash info.plist. It's a property list that contains metadata about the app. For example, which rotations are allowed. That's an example of metadata. Now, what is a property list? Well, a property list is a representation of an object hierarchy that can be stored persistently. Really what it comes down to, it's a dictionary. They're key value pairs, and it's hierarchical. There could be dictionaries within dictionaries. And it sets up a bunch of values, and there's only certain objects that could be in here, for instance, bulls, NS numbers, that strings, that type of thing. So the plist is a particular type of property list with certain specific keys. There's the notion of an Xcode scheme, and that's what you select when you select between the simulator and devices, different types of simulators, for instance. It defines the target. I say targets because there can be multiple in some cases, but think of it just being one to build and a runtime configuration. In other words, what's the hardware? And the target specifies the build instructions for the product. There is a product, and you'll see a product group thing down on the end of the navigation. Let's go over to Xcode. I have a project here called temp. If I simply hover over the icon here, it'll say set the active scheme. If I bring up the menu, I have a bunch of simulator choices, an iOS device. There's no iOS devices connected at this point in time. I'll select 3.5-inch iPhone. If I go over to this triangle, I'll get a list of project. There's only one in the workspace. And targets. And we haven't talked about test, but there's one target called temp. Close that. If I take a look at this menu over here, select a project or a target, I'll get the same list. The target corresponds to one product. If I go over to the navigator, there is products, and there is temp.app. Now, if I look in supporting files, I'll see temp-info plist, and that's where my settings are kept. Over in the center here, I'm in the Generals tab, and the Generals tab reflects some of what is in info. And info is effectively what is in info plist. So that is the metadata for the application at runtime. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about the build. I went ahead and did a build and run. Now this is nothing more than an instance of a single window template application, so it does nothing. However, if I go over in the navigator and I select Show the Log Navigator, it shows that I did a build at this particular point in time. If that's selected and I say all messages, I get a list here of everything that was done. There was a prepare temp/temp prefix pch, and compiled the various .m's, and it did other things, copied some files, string files, so on and so forth. So this gives me a pretty good indication of what the process actually was. Now I can reduce this amount of information. I can show errors only, or I can show all issues, which would be warnings and errors. There are none because it completed correctly. So that's one way of looking at the build process. Let's jump over to the project. And take a look at some of these tabs in the next slide. We have 3 tabs of interest. We have Build Settings, Build Phases, and Build Rules. Now we were already in Build Settings briefly when we talked about modules. Now this specifies a whole bunch of specifics about things like arguments that are passed to the compiler and features that are turned on and off. There's basic and all. There's a lot more in all than there is in basic. And there's also the notion of levels. These settings are inherited. There's defaults for iOS applications. There's settings for the project, and there's settings for the target. Now you can get the result of that through combined. And I'm not going to go through any of these. You may want to actually sit down and actually look at some of them to just get a general idea of what's going on. Now build phases. The build process goes through a set of phases. The first one here, in terms of target dependencies, is the first, and this relates to in the case where you have multiple targets and they are dependent on each other. That isn't the case here because we only have one. You have a compile phase, and there's only 3.m's in here, and that's all that's compiled. There's a link phase, and these are the frameworks that are used in this case. This isn't a very long list. And there's the case where you actually create the bundle. That's the last phase. Now, rules, build rules, relate to how particular file types are actually processed. You can actually create your own rules. You can create your own phases too. But there's a set of rules about what to do for particular file types. Let's go to the next slide, and we're going to talk about capabilities. The Capabilities tab allows you to enable certain types of key application features. And it's pretty clear what they are by looking at this tab. For instance, iCloud access, Game Center, Passbook, in-app purchases, and so on and so forth. And there's some security issues behind some of these. Now something simple like maps, if I turn that on, I get some capabilities I can turn on and turn on. For instance, I want bus routing and car routing, and some things will be done for me automatically. For example, if I take a look at the frameworks, MapKit has been added. If I go over to build phases and I take a look at what is linked, MapKit's also been added there. So there's some automatic aspects of these. Now, obviously, to use any of these features, you really have to dig into the APIs and the security issues and so on and so forth. We're going to stop here. We're going to leave this Xcode build stuff. And in the next episodes, we're going to jump back into UIKit and start getting into various types of views and controllers. Thanks for watching.